Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. We're really, really happy to be here in this fascinating city that we've been exploring for the last couple of days. Just going to start with a small public service announcement for you guys. This talk, it's really designed for people who are kind of at the beginning or maybe near the beginning of their journey with JavaScript and with LWC. We're going to be talking about some really foundational tools in the modern JavaScript language that we think are just kind of essential to write good components with. But what that means is if you have been doing this for a while and you're already quite familiar with topics like spread syntax, like promises, like arrow functions, this may be a little basic for you. So we're going to give you a chance to run away and see something else. But you can stay, if you like, you can stay and be like, we can make sure we get it right. I found a mistake this morning, you might find another one. Let's see how we go. Okay. Hello again, I'm Dorian. I've been working on building applications on Salesforce for about 8 years now. I work for a company called Designit in Southwest England, Salesforce consultancy. I help to run a user group down there, and I'm on Twitter if you want to say hello. This is Edith.
Salam alaikum. Is that okay? I'm Edith. I'm a senior software engineer. I am a certified Salesforce developer. I work as a freelance developer these days. And I'm a Rad Women coach. So we teach women to code in Apex. So for this presentation, we are going to be using an application that we built for this. We are going to be referring to the application a lot, so I'm going to introduce. This is a Lightning Web component. It's very basic. It doesn't have too much fancy stuff, but at the top you can see a summary of the Apex test history in our org. So it's when the tests were run, the outcome, and at the bottom you can have a list of all the tests. And it has a red color on the ones that fail. So at the top as well, we introduce a classification by type. So you can select here all the tests for the services, all the tests for the controllers, and so on. Something else that we added to this application is that we have a chart here. So we are showing by type all of the tests, and the ones that fail, and the ones that passed.
Okay, so this is how the talk's going to work. We're going to look at a few different use cases in our application with problems that we had to solve using JavaScript. We're then going to look at the JavaScript language features that we use to solve those problems, and then we're going to show you the code. Oh yeah, there's going to be a lot of code in this talk. I hope that's okay. I know it's a Salesforce conference, but we love to code. We're devs. Let's get started.
Okay, the first use case is when you need to expand an iterable. This might be an array or a map or an object. Some examples that you can use in the Lightning Web Components is where you want to add properties in the front end, like in the JavaScript, to the elements that you are bringing from the back end, from Apex, for example. And this is very important in Lightning Web Components when you use reactive wire services. And why is this? It's because reactive wire services are read-only. So if you want to add properties on the fly, you might get an error like the one you will see here on red. And yeah, so the JavaScript feature that you can use here is spread syntax. And this is pretty cool. The first time I saw 3 dots, I was thinking, is this an error or what's going on here? Well, the spread syntax is can be used when you need to shallow copy elements from one array or object to another one. So how are we going to be using this in our example, in our app? So in here, you can see the red color that I mentioned for the failed test that has a CSS class, and also the type here has a type. And those were added in the front end in the JavaScript. So the code example that we have here is we are using a wire service, nothing fancy here. We are just calling an Apex backend method And then I want to use, I want to add properties in the front end. The properties are the type and the class. So for that one, I will just be using a for. This is the traditional way of doing it, yeah? If I don't know ES6 or nothing, I will just use a for, and then I will manually copy all the properties and values from one side, the backend side, to the front-end side, let's say. And then I will just add my two properties using the dot notation, the class and the type. And the other place where I can use this one is because remember that I have a filter for the type. So in that case, I'm using two arrays in the front end. So for my second array, that is the one that is displaying the results, I am using the same for, and I'm copying manually using push to the second array the elements of the backend. Mm-hmm. So if I use express syntax, how can I change this? So this for and this manual copy, I can change it with 3 dots. See, can you see it's pretty neat? So I use the 3 dots in the object, and it's going to have the same effect. And I also can use the 3 dots using in my array. So here I am manually pushing, but instead of this, I can just access each element and copy them using the 3 dots here. Mm-hmm.
It's like a wrestling match. Okay. Just before we hit the next use case, I'm going to talk to you just for a moment about arrow functions, because they're, again, a really foundational part of the ES6 JavaScript specification, which LWC is basically based on, and you will see them everywhere. And also just to show you a little bit the difference between a function declaration and a function expression. So what we got up here is a classic anonymous function in a piece of code. Don't worry about what it does that much, but essentially, we've got a function declaration right here. We're passing it a function as a parameter, and then we execute the function. It's about as insecure a piece of code as you could think of. It's also full of bugs. This will not work in at least 2 different ways. If you know what both of them are, you should probably come up and teach the rest of the presentation. But let me show you how we did this in slightly more modern fashion. This one works. I just tried it. It's a little pixelated, but we're using a function, arrow function here, fat arrow syntax. If you've done any work in Java or C#, you may recognize that. No function declaration. And because it's so condensed, we can just use this instead of defining it as a separate expression, just passing it right through to our function here. Now, why does this work and this not? You get into this strange issue of hoisting, which you might have come across in JavaScript with variable declarations as well. Function declarations are hoisted, function expressions are not. So what happens here is we're trying to execute a function before we've actually defined it, and that's going to give you an error. Here, we don't have that problem. We're passing our function directly in, no hoisting issues. Even more important is that an arrow function is going to use the this superglobal object from the context in which we call it. And what that means is that's going to give you access to your properties, to your methods. It's going to enable you to interrogate the front end, the HTML inside your component. This is going to give you undefined. So that's 2 good reasons to use an arrow function, but also the condensed syntax. Let's have a look at a couple of examples here. And because this is JavaScript, there's always more than one way to write stuff. I'm not going to go through all of these. We're a little short on time, but just be advised that there's different possibilities. You can use a return statement. You cannot use a return statement. You have to use empty brackets to signify no arguments, and be a little bit careful about returning object syntax. So the use cases for these.
Okay, the second use case is when you need to do operations on arrays. And in the front end, we use arrays a lot. So some examples would be when you need to filter data according to some conditions, when you need to add properties to the front end to each element in an array, as we saw previously. Or when you need to calculate totals, like to the summary that we display in the example application. The feature we can use here is modern array methods. And there are many of them, but we are going to focus on 3 to give you some examples. The first one will be filter. And I think I really like these ones because they take a function to do some work for you. So the filter one will take a function that is going to be selecting or applying a logic to tell JavaScript which objects to add or to reject to a second array. Map is going to, again, take a function, and then it's going to go through each element of an array, and it's going to apply that function and give you back a second array. And reduce is going to return a single value after executing a reducer function, again, a function, in each element of an array. The syntax is like this, so all of them take a function. But the only thing to be aware is that reduce takes 2 values. We'll see some examples now.
Here's how we did it. 3 different areas in the application where we use these functions, at least 3. Looking at how we filter our results using the drop-down right there. We're going to look at how we do some highlighting, changing a little CSS around here for failed, and also how we calculate this value up here so we can see the total time taken. So this is the kind of JavaScript I would have written a couple of years ago. There's nothing really wrong with it. You know, we're creating an array, we're looping over some results, we have a conditional here, and we're populating our array. There's nothing wrong with it, it's going to work, but I don't know, it's not great to read. Multiple layers of logic here, that's kind of a code smell for me. Wouldn't it be great if we could, squash this up a little bit? 1 line. You do 1 line with an arrow function called .filter. Takes an arrow. A little function expression here. If that expression equates to true, it's going to return that particular element into the array that comes back. I like that more.
The second example is using a map. And remember this code that we've been working with? Previously, we used the 3 dots inside the for. So I can use a map to do, instead of this, I can do this. So what I'm doing is I am not using the for loop anymore because map is going to iterate on each element itself. It's something similar to the for, basically. And then I'm passing the function that is, and again, an arrow function. And what is going to happen to each element is going to first copy all of the properties and values to the new object, and then it's going to add the 2 new properties, that is class and type. So basically, the same as we had before, but we're using map.
There you are. Don't want to give away the game too soon. Yeah, last piece of functionality here. This is a real simple bit of calculation, right? We only need to simply add up a series of numbers. But what you will see in the wild and what you'll need to do yourself is much more complicated calculations on data that's stored in an array. And that means that this fairly straightforward piece of code here could get much longer, much more difficult to understand. So again, we've got some arrow syntax. The reduce array method is really helpful because it gives you a constantly iterating value that you can work with, and also another parameter to give you the current element in your array, and also a default value which is going to help you not get a null pointer exception, okay, if your array is empty. However, there are possibly some reasons not to do this that we're going to talk about. Not everybody likes to use this. Firstly, because, as I said, these can actually get kind of complicated. You could imagine the sort of calculations you might need to do. And because it's recursive, recursion is always a funny one. For me, I have seen probably more bugs in recursive functionality than really anywhere else. So you kind of need to think about clean code, concise code, which is better. It's also, the more concise your code is, I think, probably the more documentation you should do and the more careful you should be how you name things. But one more other thing that we thought about quite recently in a big application I wrote for a client is that none of these array methods that we use have the ability to break from the array. And what that means is if you end up with an array that has thousands or maybe even tens of thousands of records in, you can get real performance problems. Another issue with that is there are many people who would tell you that the business logic of an application doesn't really belong with the display logic. And a lot of people would write that in Apex. Whether you would, let me know.
The third use case is when you need to conditionally render or format elements in your lineable component. Some examples would be when you need to display data in a different format to the one you brought from the backend, or when you need to use a different CS class in different div elements, depending on some values, or when you need to use different, basically when you need to give a different experience to any profile that is logging into your site experience, cloud, for example, you can use a different HTML template in your lineable components using this method. And the feature is getters. You can think of a getter as a function that is attached to a property that whenever the property is accessed, the function is executed. So because it's a function, so every time you access the property, you might get a different value. So in this example, imagine that I already sent this application to my client, and they come back and say, well, no, I actually, instead of this, I want the date in a different format. And I also want some additional feature that instead of just having this color, I want it in red or green according to some value. So something like this, yeah? Green color here and the date format. So the example here is using a getter. So in this case, the property is named execution date. And the function is just going to call another function to format the data. And to use it in your HTML part, you just access the property itself. The second example is to change the CSS class according to some logic. So in this case, I have this property, and the logic is going to return error or success according to this value. And then again, you just use the property at the top.
Okay, so the next use is actually reuse. I guess everybody's familiar with the term DRY, don't repeat yourself. But as consultants, we see an awful lot of other people's code, and we see a lot of people doing a lot of that. One really useful thing you can do with JavaScript is you have access to a whole world of code, of libraries, of public domain and paid-for services that we can import and make use of. In our application, we use one called Highcharts, which is real useful. And often you're going to need it more than once. If it's that good, you're probably going to want to use it in multiple LWCs. And one thing that I've seen many, many times is people will simply cut and paste an entire JavaScript library or application and just stick it into a component. Particularly with the Aura framework, everybody used to use jQuery. I can't tell you how many times we saw a minified version of the entire jQuery library just sitting in an Aura component. But there's actually a great feature in ES6, again, called modules, that means that we can get around that whole cut and pasting thing. A module is simply any related set of JavaScript code that we want to use. And until you make it into a module, the variables, the functions, the objects, much as they are in an Apex class, they're private. We have to make them available. And we do that by using export and import. Just to illustrate that, I'm sure you've worked it out. We're going to export from our library and import into our component. Here's another way of doing it, is another way that we might have used before modules. What we got here is a Lightning Web component, and we're creating a whole new method here. It simply contains some really boilerplate JavaScript that we've probably used in a million places. to do a bit of date formatting, which is okay, but we'd much rather just do it once. So what we did in our application was we created a new Lightning Web component just with some JavaScript in it, no CSS, no HTML. And in that, we have a function declaration for the same piece of code, but more importantly, down here, we export it. The default keyword is pretty important here. You can have as many export statements as you like, but only one is default. It's usually simpler to export everything at the same time. In this function, we only have one. And then we have a much more simple, reusable piece of code. We simply import. And if you've done anything with LWC, you will recognize the import syntax. And then we can simply execute our function the way we would as if it was defined right there.
The last use case is when you need to execute a sequence of asynchronous tasks. The keyword here is that they have to be executed one after another. So you have to wait for the first to finish until you start executing the second. Some examples, well, as Dorian mentioned, we are using a charge library. And another example would be when you need to save a record in Salesforce and then wait for that to finish to reload the information and display values that you calculate in formulas. The feature here is asynchronous programming, that is promises. You can think of a promise as an object that is going to be a placeholder that JavaScript is going to call after it finishes a long running computation. So in a promise, you specify some code that has to be executed if the long-running computation succeeds. That will be when it resolves, so it's the part on the then. And if some error happens, it's a reject, so it's going to execute the catch block. So how are we using it in our application? We are using it in the chart. We are loading high charts here, and we are loading another module that is the exporting module for this zone. So this is how it looks like. What we are doing here is we are doing 3 long-running computations. The first one will be to load high charts. The second one will be to load the exporting modules. And finally, calling Apex to get my totals of my tests. Every time, if there is an error, I will just show an error here, here, and here. And finally, if everything goes well, I will just draw my chart at the end.
Okay. So I'm sure you don't need us to tell you that promises are an incredibly important feature of modern JavaScript. In fact, they're really what makes modern web applications possible, right? Because if you think about the kind of web applications that we all use now every day to book our flights, to buy our groceries, to use social media applications, everything happens on a single page. We don't have this whole kind of submit and wait thing anymore. Well, actually, you do in Salesforce sometimes. But the point is that it's really a powerful feature, and that syntax that we just showed you, I don't know, it can get a little bit hard to understand. And that's why a couple of versions later on with the language, they brought in the async and await syntax as a wrapper for the promise syntax. It does make things a bit more comfortable. Using await sends a message to the JavaScript runtime. It halts all JavaScript processing, halts the whole execution stack until a promise settles and returns a result. The interesting thing is that if the promise returns as you would expect and gives us a decent result, then it simply executes the next line in the program. However, if the promise does not return a result, it's a rejection, the code itself will throw an exception, which means we always have to use try-catch. I'm guessing you guys probably know about try-catch. So here is the code that Eddie showed you before. Now, you could probably think about this in a more complex application. We're probably not just going to have like one line in each of these. And so what you can end up with is a piece of code that looks like the side of a mountain with just extension after extension after extension, and it gets real hard to read. Here's how we can do it with async and await. just a single line. We're awaiting a promise to settle. We have a single set of error handling code in here. That is a much nicer and cleaner way to build that promise syntax. Well, thanks very much for listening, guys. I hope this hasn't been too basic for you. I hope we've been able to give you something from this talk. We've got a few conclusions for you, but the first one is that JavaScript is changing all the time. There's a new release every year. There's all kinds of useful features in there. I highly recommend that you check them out.
Mm-hmm. The second one would be that the features make for a more readable and modern code, which might be subjective. Some of you might say, well, why would I replace something that is very clear in a for loop with a reduce that is just like something like super hard to read? But that's the importance of this, that you can decide when to use what according to your context and to your team.
It's a real cliche to say, but knowledge is power in any kind of software development. There is so much available on JavaScript for us to read and look at and learn from. Personally, I found that when I did the JavaScript certification for Salesforce recently, I learned more about JavaScript off-platform than I'd learned in probably the last 10 years.
And also looking at examples of the use of the features is a good way of increasing our knowledge. I come from a back-end background, so I was a Java developer for many years. And when I moved to Linear Web Components, it was actually pretty hard for me because JavaScript is like another world, sort of. But the way that I learned was like staying in teams with very senior JavaScript developers. So I saw other examples, and that's how I became more comfortable with it.
Yeah, and actually I'm the complete opposite of Eddie. I came from a background of writing a lot of CSS and HTML and web applications. And I have the same problem. I have the promise syntax, all of that stuff was really hard for me to get. But the reality is that just like Salesforce, JavaScript is constantly evolving. We have to keep up with it. Salesforce are actually really good at keeping up with new JavaScript features. One of the links we're going to show you in a minute, there's a link to a GitHub repo where you can go and check out how Salesforce is coping with some of the new ES standards that are coming out. Just got a few resources here. You might want to take a picture. There's a lot of really bad JavaScript resources around. I found this out. I made a mistake in the first part of this talk and just fixed it half an hour before we started. These are good. The Salesforce documentation on JavaScript is excellent. And yeah, we're here if you have any questions or any thoughts about what we've been talking about.
Thank you.
Well, is it working? Is it working? Yeah. Sure. So I would like to thank you for the presentation, for the introduction to JavaScript and all of that. Like, we know that JavaScript is very important. There is another language that is TypeScript that helps a lot with the like error handling and having types in this Java environment. So do you see Salesforce implementing TypeScript in LWC?
Really good
Yeah.
question. I don't think it could happen anytime soon. I like TypeScript for a long time. Not as loud as I thought. Okay. Yeah, I like TypeScript. I've used it for some off-platform stuff. There was a great talk at London Calling last year, actually, about using TypeScript in LWC. There are ways to do it. It's a bit complicated. You might want to check it out, though. Any other comments? Todd's going to tell us we got it all wrong.
Thank you. No, this was excellent. Thank you. I guess a couple of things. So the talk at London's Calling you mentioned, all the talks at London's Calling are up on our YouTube channel. So if you go to londonscalling.net, you can have a look at the past sessions. That would be good. Yeah, and the TypeScript one's excellent. I was mostly wondering about the evolution of directives in templates with LWC and how you see kind of maybe performance trade-offs in terms of putting like an LWC if in a template as to whether you render it conditionally or you're using a filter to remove items from an array. I mean, I don't know any of the benchmarking behind this, but I wondered if you did or you had any views readability-wise.
That's a tricky one because the trade-off between readability and scalability is kind of interesting. I've definitely had components that I had to kind of rewrite because they were slow. Particularly some of the things that we showed you, like with charting libraries, like you could be passing a huge amount of data, and you've got to format it into a really complex sort of mapping of JSON. And sometimes you almost have to go and make a coffee while it's doing it. So yeah, performance is something that we're always looking at. But I don't think there's one answer to it though.
So, question is straightforward. Do you have any advice for managing separation of concern in a AWS environment, knowing that business standard?
Separation of concerns in LWC. Yeah, probably up until maybe 2 years ago, we were using Aura components for everything, and we were quite strict about really doing all the business logic in Apex. I don't think that's necessarily how it has to be anymore. I think new features, I think the GraphQL wire adapter that someone was talking about earlier, and just the wire service generally means that it's possible to kind of build more into JavaScript. I don't think that's a bad thing. But as we was talking to Don about this last night, Apex is probably still the best way of interacting with Salesforce data. So anything sort of very Salesforce related is probably still better done in Apex, I think. Could be wrong about that. There's really no definite answers to this stuff, but it's a good question. Ooh, we can have 2 microphones. I think we might be at about time now, but okay. Well, I'm going to say thank you very much for having us at this fantastic conference. Oh, and before you go, please some applause for the AV team who have really helped us out today. Thank you very much, guys.